think what's changing is that hiring was very much an event-driven phenomena earlier. I think as we go into this world, which is much more complex, much more uncertain, much more volatile, I think what we are finding is leadership decisions are becoming much more, longer-term process-oriented. So it's about thinking about succession much before it actually needs to happen. It's about thinking about potential future leaders. It's about thinking about 2 or 3 years ahead of what's going to happen. How you're grooming people to get there, how you're developing people to get there. That might have both an internal component, it might have an external component. And I think the other big change is, in terms of, you said, what is the changing trend in hiring? I think in the past, we've looked to hire very often for experience and competence. But what we are finding today is that the future itself is quite unpredictable. So earlier we used to say, past performance is the best predictor of future success. Today, when the future is unpredictable, a lot of our work that we are doing and the IP that we are developing is really about predicting potential. It's not just about what you did and what your track record was before, but do you have the potential to grow into your next role? Do you have the potential to grow into a bigger role? Do you have the potential to deliver in a more uncertain environment? And I think that's going to become very critical. And I think leadership decisions are being driven now much more on identifying who the high potentials are and betting on your high potentials. I think, there are some kind of broad fundamental traits that you need to have. So I think broadly, we first start with motivation. But do you have the right motivation to be able to make impact in an organization? So, are you driven by making bigger impact rather than just, it's not about you, it's about the organization. The other aspect is, which we look at very deeply, is what we call identity. Do you identify yourself as a leader? Are you willing to make the sacrifices that are required to be a leader? Do you understand what the job entails and you're willing to commit to that? A lot of people think about getting into a role but haven't reconciled with what it means to identify themselves with that role. And then I think the kind of markers that we look for potential is one is what we call curiosity. It's really about how do you always update yourself? Are you thirsty for knowledge? Are you going out there to be able to learn what's happening in the digital space? How is my business going to get impacted by technology disruption? The other thing that we'll think leaders in the future will need to be particularly focused on is market insight. How can they take trends and developments that are happening in the marketplace and to be able to derive insight as to what it means for their particular business. We talked about the world being more uncertain and volatile, and so potential leaders will probably need to be much more resilient. They'll need to be able to deal with the ups and downs of business, which is going to be the new normal. And also, I think what we are finding is that potential leaders are pretty determined and remain focused on their objective. It's not about changing strategy, every 6 months or every 1 year. It's about being resilient, being focused, and moving forward with that. And I think lastly, it's about ability to engage with teams. I think most organizations today are pretty globally dispersed. You have individuals all around the world that you need to manage. It's not the command and control anymore. You've got to really manage them through influencing and engaging them and inspiring them. And I think the other thing that's a big difference is there's much more deeper scrutiny of companies from multiple stakeholders, whether it's regulators, whether it's social media. There's much closer scrutiny of companies, and I think that's demanding deeper engagement with the external environment. Earlier, you could be just focused on your business and not worry about the external environment. Today, you need to worry about a lot more than just your shareholders. And we've seen many examples, whether it's the oil spill in Mexico, or other situations where how you need to deal with what's happening and how the environment is reacting to that, I think is going to be very important. So those are some of the things that we are looking for in potential leaders. And that is quite different from maybe what we looked at 5 or 10 years ago.
In addition to those characteristics, we're looking for competencies, and we're looking for industry knowledge and skills. So there is a spectrum of requirements. The interesting thing about the analysis that Rajiv just shared with you, which is the model that we use for assessing potential leaders, is that those fundamental issues of motivation, identity, and those character traits of resilience and determination and insight and engagement, they're essentially about character. So, you know, I think the leaders of the future are leaders that lead from values and character.
So leadership is just becoming harder, basically. So we don't use big data because I don't think our data is that big and it's not necessarily all comparable. But I do think what we use is we actually calibrate and benchmark the assessments that we do on leaders and how they track both as individuals as well as when you look at teams and organizations as a whole. So very often we'll be able to go into our clients and say, if this is where you're expecting to be 5 years from now in terms of your strategic objectives, what is the kind of talent you have in your organization and how does it benchmark against best in class in this particular industry or in the country? So we are able to do those kind of analytics to be able to give a good sense of how do you calibrate against the market. That's very useful for some of our clients to be able to either focus on what needs to be developed or if are there any gaps in the organization that need to be filled from the outside. So it's a great way to take an inventory of your existing assets in a way and say where are the gaps and what do I need to make sure that I can develop these gaps over a period of time.
I think there are two other big concerns that I hear about. Sustainability is really important. I think increasingly leaders understand that we need business models that are sustainable. And I don't just mean that in the politically correct sense of that word sustainable. Sustainable business models that continue to create value for generations to come. I think there's a recognition there's been too much short-termism and that's not good for the planet and it's not good for stakeholders and people. I think the second big topic that I've heard a lot lately, and particularly at Davos, where I had to lead a group on this particular topic, and that is re-earning the trust of stakeholders. I think there's a real sense in the business community that trust has been destroyed. There was a major survey done last year by one of the leading global public relations firms, and they found that 18%, only 18% trusted business leaders to tell the truth. Now that is a problem because the system works on trust. Not just the business system, the political system. All aspects of our society require trust. So when trust breaks down, everything breaks down. So the business community in particular, which is what we're primarily focused on today, needs to re-earn trust. And that's about a greater level of transparency, it's about a greater level of consistency, walking the talk, it's about addressing some of the concerns about imbalances in compensation, which clearly have been, in some circumstances, some situations, egregious. So re-earning trust is the other big topic. So sustainability, re-earning trust, and developing future leaders, or attracting and developing talent within organizations. The three big topics I think that we hear. I think that's a very tough issue actually, because in a sense the compensation issue is a byproduct of the increased transparency of today's world. When I joined our firm 25, 26 years ago, CEOs didn't really know what other CEOs earned. And because we now have public data on compensation, there is a tendency for every CEO to want to ratchet up their compensation. Everyone wants to be in the top 10 percentile. And because these are proud people, they're overachievers, they're insecure. And so we have a dynamic which is pushing the mean up all the time. We need a circuit breaker. We need some way to get the platform back down. I do think this is absolutely on the agenda of the leading boards of the major corporations in the world. There are some legacy issues because a lot of the compensation contracts that are proving problematic now were contracts written 5, 10 years ago. So when we see CEOs seemingly getting paid off for failure, those contracts are legacy contracts. So I think you'll find going forward, boards are much more mindful of the kinds of arrangements that are being entered into with executives. But it's not going to go away. Human nature being what it is, this is always going to be a tension, and after all, there is a demand and supply for talent globally, and as the world has become more global and the talent market has become more global, that has had a natural impact on this dynamic as well. And I think the last thing I would say, and you know, we're acutely aware of this being in the profession that we are, top talent is scarce. You know, it is tough to find individuals who are capable and able of leading big, large, complex organizations in today's world. There are legacy issues relating to arrangements that have been entered into previously. My own view is that boards are addressing this issue now, and that in the future, I think that we're going to see less of the egregious arrangements that we might have seen 6 or 8 or 10 years ago in the bull market. When there's a rising tide, as we know, the rocks don't show, and people are prepared to do deals. When the tide goes out, you can see where the problems are, and I think that's what's happened in the financial crisis.
I don't think regulation has ever achieved, you know, the required impact, to my mind. So even if you look at the regulation that we've had about what you can pay managing directors, etc., people are hired under different nomenclatures. At the end of the day, this is a demand supply, you know, it's a market for talent, and you will have to pay, you know, the market price to attract somebody. My view is that talent is also becoming much more global and mobile today. So the market for talent is no longer local, it's also become global. You know, you see so many overseas Indians coming back into India to work in the market. If you're going to be able to bring that talent into the market, you've got to pay what it, you know, what is required, which is the market benchmark compensation. So I think the drive here has got to be a little more self-regulation. It's got to be possibly more stakeholder activism in this area, demanding greater transparency, greater rationalization. And I think what Damien was talking about, I think most of the issues that we are seeing in compensation are actually related not to the fixed or the variable compensation, but a lot of the golden handshakes and, you know, the exit clauses, etc., which tend to be very onerous. And I think those are all under the scanner at the moment as we speak. I think what you're seeing is that there is compensation is becoming more related to, I would imagine, a little more longer term orientation. It's not about short term orientation, cashing out and then you know, making a huge packet. It's about, are you going to sustain performance over a longer period of time? And I think a lot of compensation today is performance oriented. How you measure performance, I think, is the big issue. In fact, if I look at compensation in the US, for example, a lot of it is actually variable compensation. So you kind of live and die by how the company performs, which may not be very true in India. You know, you've got a high fixed compensation and not such a large variable component. So does that drive the right behaviors? I don't think it does, but I think it's really about what performance measures are you using to, you know, to really kind of indicate that this is the performance that you want.
I think there's no doubt that in today's world, There's a sense that the imbalances have become disproportionate and inappropriate, and are acting as blockages to sustainable business. However, I happen to share Rajiv's view that regulation is actually a band-aid. It's much more important to address the more fundamental issues here, and that's about culture, it's about corporate culture, and it's about the kind of leadership that you want to show. And I think that's where you'll drive fundamental change. The trouble with regulation is that, sadly, regulation always has unintended consequences, which tend to be quite serious and grave, usually. And someone else pays the price for that. So regulation is obviously necessary to a point, but it's not the nirvana, in my view, and I think history shows that.
Good talent is always in short supply. I mean, what is the most difficult thing? The most difficult thing is to get your first board membership. Anytime we go to a client, it's about, find me somebody who's an experienced board member. How do you get experience if you never get your first board membership? So a lot of our focus, for example, is actually enlarging the supply pool, looking at not only just retired executives or looking at bureaucrats, we are looking at serving CEOs, we're looking at serving CFOs, actually going to companies and talking about the fact that why, if some of their executives sit on boards, they bring huge value back to their own companies. It's looking at academics, it's looking at people in public social service areas. So I think there's a large supply pool that can be tapped. And I think that's where firms like ours play a huge role, because we have access to that talent pool. We engage with that talent pool on a regular basis. So far, board appointments to a large extent have been made through your own network of limited number of people. So when you canvass those 10 people, they only come up with 20 names. But if you come to us, we probably come up with 200 names. What we are also doing at the same time is to make sure that we are engaging with, for example, potential women directors in educating them about how they can become directors, what is required to become a director, putting them in touch with other directors so that there's, a possibility of mentorship. So I think that's the kind of role that we are playing. In a lot of countries around the world, we've actually been the leading light on something that we call the Club of 30, where we have taken, it's again self-regulation, where we have committed to making sure that every time we have a short list of candidates, 30% of them are diversity candidates. That's a way that we can contribute. That doesn't mean that we are not supporting meritocracy and making sure that the right candidate is there. But I think what we are ensuring is that we are surfacing a fresh pool of candidates that otherwise may not have made the list.
My personal view is targets are a more effective tool, naming and shaming and having targets. It's a horse and cart issue. Unless boards become more representative of both genders, then you're not going to move the dial. I mean, so you need to do something, jumpstart. I don't happen to be a fan of quotas myself, but I can absolutely understand why quotas are being adopted, because we've been slow to move, and you need to do something. If you are going to champion diversity in the workplace, you need to have diversity at board level. You cannot have a message about diversity in the workplace and not have a board that mirrors that. That's the reality. So you need to be working on both dimensions. There's very much a notion of companies negotiating directly with its workforce, and that creates more flexibility. Whether that's the right thing at the end of the day, I'm not sure. Unions played a very important role during the Industrial Revolution to protect the rights of workers. I'm sure they've still got a role to play. But hopefully, as big corporations become more responsible and more engaged with their stakeholders, there are other mechanisms for protecting workers. But it's a very interesting observation. I haven't had that pointed out to me. Well, it could also become a check and balance on companies who are abusing their workforce. Oh, it is a check and balance on companies because consumers don't want to, they don't want to give their custom to companies that are abusive of their workforce. You know, you think of Nike and Nestle, the problems they've had through consumer movements that have basically protested against those companies because of some abuses in their system in the years gone past. So I think that's a healthy development, don't you? That level of transparency and scrutiny. In the past, CEOs basically had a knowledge arbitrage. They knew more than their stakeholders. They knew more than their employees. They knew more than their consumers. These days, many CEOs are finding out information at the same time as their consumers, as their employees. So if you don't know more than someone else, you've got to exercise authority on a different basis. Knowledge is power, after all. And so that's demanding a different kind of response and a different kind of leadership. And I think that's driving quite a different approach as well. I mean, we haven't used the expression emotional intelligence in this conversation, but a lot of the attributes that Rajiv mentioned earlier are attributes of emotional intelligence. What we now know is that the most effective leaders in today's world are what we would call emotionally intelligent. They're very aware of themselves, they're very aware of others, they're able to empathize with others, they're able to build effective relationships, and I think that is a model, you know, that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about CEOs, effective leaders at least. We have an expression, I don't think we've mentioned it in this interview, but you know, there's an old saying in our firm that people get hired for the hard factors and fired for the soft.